King John, 1199 to 1216. John's reputation was built on force, cruelty, and sustained abuses of power. He burdened the kingdom with heavy taxes and fines, notably repeated scourges, and used arbitrary justice, hostage-taking, and intimidation to break opponents. He is widely suspected of ordering the killing of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, 1203, and is linked to the starvation deaths of Matilda, Maud de Braose, and her son, 2010, while in royal custody. His quarrel with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton led to a church ban on England, 1208 to 1213, and John's excommunication, 1209. He later surrendered England to the Pope and took it back as a papal fief, papal territory, 1213, to secure support. In the military, he lost Normandy, 1204, and after defeat at Bouvines, 1214, faced a baronial revolt. Forced to accept Magna Carta 1215 at Runnymede, he repudiated it with papal backing, reigniting war. His forces, including foreign mercenaries, ravaged rebel lands during the First Barons' War. John died of illness in 1216, shortly after losing his baggage train in the Wash. Contemporaries were harsh. The chronicler Matthew Paris later wrote that, foul as it is, hell itself is defiled by the presence of King John, a line that captures the medieval verdict. Even considering biased sources, the charge sheet, judicial arbitrariness, suspected murder, church conflict, fiscal oppression, and war against his own nobles explains why John endures as one of England's most notoriously tyrannical rulers. Mary I, Bloody Mary, reigned 1553 to 1558. Mary I was the Catholic queen who set out to reverse the English Reformation. What places her on a most evil list is the Marian persecution between 1555 and 1558. The Crown revived the Heresy Acts and burned roughly 280 Protestants at the stake, including Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer, with dozens more dying in prison and around 800 fleeing abroad as Marian exiles. The campaign, highly public and intended to deter dissent, fixed her posthumous label, as John Fox's 1563 Martyrology popularized. She became Bloody Mary. Mary came to the throne in July 1553 after defeating the Lady Jane Grey coup, then restored papal supremacy 1554 under Cardinal Pole, and repealed much of Edwardian religious law. Her marriage to Philip of Spain 1554 was deeply unpopular, sparking Wyatt's Rebellion 1554, which was crushed. Jane Grey was executed soon after. Her government relied on trusted advisors and some Spanish guidance. Though English leaders held primary control, censorship increased, and prominent Protestants were targeted through church courts and royal orders. Foreign policy ended badly. The loss of Calais, 1558, England's last foothold in France, was a strategic and symbolic blow. Mary endured 2 phantom pregnancies and died on the 17th of November 1558, succeeded by Elizabeth I. Contemporary and near-contemporary comment was severe. Protestant writers chronicled the burnings in detail, and the nickname Bloody Mary entered common use. Even some Catholic observers judged the executions counterproductive. On the evidence, state persecution, religious coercion, political repression, and a costly foreign reserve, Mary's short reign remains one of the starkest examples of punitive rule in Tudor England. Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the second Tudor king of England. What puts him on a most evil list is his use of the state to eliminate opponents. The Treason Acts 1534 made denial of his supremacy a capital offence. High-profile executions followed, including Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, 1535. His queens Anne Boleyn, 1536, and Catherine Howard, 1542, Protestant heretics such as Anne Askew, 1546, and northern leaders after the Pilgrimage of Grace, 1536–37. He is suspected of using unfair trials in purges driven by court rivalries, notably under Thomas Cromwell, who was himself executed in 1540 due to political opposition. Henry's King's Great Matter His effort to end marriage severed ties with Rome. By the Act of Supremacy 1534, he made himself head of the Church of England, then ordered the dissolution of the monasteries 1536 to 1541, closing around 800 houses, seizing assets and displacing thousands. Rebellions in the north were crushed. Robert Ascii and leading nobles were executed. Religious policy shifted sharply between Catholic and Protestant beliefs, punishing both sides at different times. War with France and Scotland and lavish court spending demanded heavy taxation and forced loans. Contemporaries were blunt. Imperial ambassador Eustace Chapus portrayed Henry as capricious and cruel in dispatches, while Reginald Pole condemned him as a tyrant in print. Even admirers of his magnificence could not ignore the record: religious coercion, judicial terror, large-scale asset seizures, and bloody repression of opposition. Sir Charles Trevelyan, Irish Famine Relief Policy, 1845 to 1849. Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, 1807 to 1886, was Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and the key civil servant overseeing government relief during the Great Irish Famine. What places him on a most evil list is the policy mix he drove: strict laissez-faire, fear of dependency, and a moralizing view of the crisis that curtailed life-saving aid at scale. Under Trevelyan, the Treasury wound down public works in 1847 and closed the Temporary Relief Soup Kitchen Act after a few months, shifting support to the poor law, workhouses funded by local rates in districts already destitute. He resisted sustained state grain distribution, preferring market supply, and pressed for local responsibility, even as mortality and disease surged. Contemporary outcomes are stark: about 1 million deaths and 1 million emigrants during the famine, rising to around 2 million by the mid-1850s, with Ireland's population falling from 8.2 to 8.5 million in 1841 to 6.5 million in 1851. Trevelyan defended his approach in the Irish Crisis 1848, calling the famine a divine event and warning against broad aid. Criticism was immediate and lasting. The Lord Lieutenant, Lord Clarendon, complained of Treasury parsimony. Irish newspapers condemned London's caution. Nationalist writer John Mitchell argued British policy turned blight into famine. Trevelyan was later knighted, KCB, and became Governor of Madras, but his famine role remains heavily censured. A civil service program that prioritised markets and deterrence over emergency provisioning, leaving the poorest countries to bear the worst losses. Cecil Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, 1890 to 1896. Cecil Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, was a British mining magnate, co-founder of De Beers, 1888, and politician who drove imperial expansion in South Africa. What places him on a most evil list is his record of racially discriminatory lawmaking, territorial seizure, and violent conquest. As Cape Premier, he pushed the Glen Grey Act, 1894, curbing African landholding and promoting migrant labour through taxes and tightened controls. He backed property-based franchise rules that effectively disenfranchised most black residents. Through the British South Africa Company, BSAC, he promoted the occupation and naming of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, and sanctioned campaigns that crushed African resistance. The Metabel and Shona uprisings of 1893 to 94 and 1896 to 97, leaving thousands dead or displaced. His involvement in the abortive Jameson Raid, 1895 to 96, an armed incursion into the South African Republic, forced his resignation and destabilized the region. Rhodes spoke only in racial terms. The finest race in the world, as one of his best-known remarks, ran and cast empire as a civilizing and economic mission. Admirers in his day called him an empire builder and praised his philanthropy, including Rhodes scholarships from 1902. Critics such as J.A. Hobson and South African writers like Olive Schreiner pointed to profiteering, coercion, and dispossession. Modern assessments link his policies to the foundations of segregation, later formalized as apartheid. On the record, discriminatory legislation, disenfranchisement, armed expansion, and a racial worldview Rhodes remains one of the most controversial leaders in British imperial history. Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, Boer War concentration camps, 1889 to 1902. Horatio Herbert Kitchener, 1850 to 1916, was a senior British commander, victor at Omdurman, 1898, Commander-in-Chief in South Africa, 1900 to 1902, and later Secretary of State for War, 1914 to 1916. What places him on a most evil list is his conduct in the Second Boer War, a scorched earth strategy, and the creation of a civilian concentration camp system. From 1900, Kitchener ordered the destruction of farms, seizure of livestock, and barbed wire blockhouse lines to contain Boer commandos. Women and children were removed to camps. Conditions, overcrowding, inadequate rations, poor sanitation were lethal. In the Boer white camps, roughly 115,000 internees were held, and about 26,000 died, the majority children. In the black African camps, at least 100,000 to 130,000 people were interned. Deaths numbered tens of thousands, estimates commonly 14,000 plus, with higher figures argued due to incomplete records. Following Emily Hobhouse's 1901 expose, the Fawcett Commission confirmed grave failings. Mortality rates fell only after reforms. Kitchener called the camps refugee camps and defended them as necessary for the war. Supporters in Britain praised his strong leadership, but critics were harsh. Liberal leader Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman condemned Britain's cruel methods. The camp system of destruction of the countryside caused lasting harm in South Africa and damaged Britain's reputation. Kitchener died in 1916 when HMS Hampshire struck a mine. His Boer War policies, civilian internment, punitive destruction, and preventable mass death are at the core of the case against him in any catalogue of Britain's most notorious leaders. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, Armistice Massacre, 1919. Reginald Edward Harry Dyer, 1864 to 1927, was a British Indian Army officer who briefly held command in Punjab in 1919. What places him on a most evil list is the Amritsar Massacre. On the 13th of April 1919, at Jallianwala Bagh, Dyer marched troops to a walled garden where thousands had gathered, many for a peaceful political meeting, others for a festival, and opened fire without warning. His men fired until nearly out of ammunition, aiming into the densest parts of the crowd and towards exits. Official colonial figures recorded 379 dead and around 1,200 wounded. Indian estimates put the toll far higher. In the days that followed, under martial law, authorities imposed collective punishments in Amritsar, including public floggings and the notorious crawling order. On one street, Dyer later told the public inquiry he had acted to produce a moral effect and would have used a machine gun had access allowed. The Hunter Commission, 1919-20, condemned his conduct as unjustified. He was relieved of command and forced to retire, 1920. Though not court-martialed. Reaction in Britain split opinion. In the House of Commons, Winston Churchill called the shooting monstrous. The Morning Post organised a public subscription that raised tens of thousands of pounds for Dyer, with supporters hailing him as the saviour of the Punjab. In India, outrage was immediate. Rabindranath Tagore returned his knighthood, and the episode became a catalyst for nationwide protest. Dyer died in 1927. His name remains synonymous with state violence against civilians. Robert Clive, Clive of India, Governor of Bengal. Robert Clive, 1725 to 1774, was a soldier and East India Company official who twice served as Governor and Commander-in-Chief of Bengal, 1757 to 1760, 1765 to 1767. What puts him on a most evil list is the way he seized political control of Bengal for a private company, changed rulers for profit, and embedded a revenue system that enabled large-scale extraction from one of the richest provinces in Asia. After the Battle of Plassey, 1757, Clive installed Mir Jafar as Nawab and took enormous presents from the new regime. His declared personal haul was about £234,000 plus a jagir worth around £27,000 a year. vast by 18th century standards. He later secured the WWII 1765 from the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, giving the company the right to collect land revenue across Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, while local rulers carried the costs of civil administration. This dual system favored company profits and private wealth, reduced protections for farmers and traders, and helped create conditions that worsened the Bengal famine of 1769 to 1773, though Clive had left Bengal by 1767. Clive was investigated by the House of Commons 1772 to 1773 over corruption and presence. He escaped punishment, Parliament resolving that he had rendered great and meritorious services, but his methods were fiercely attacked in print and debate. Even his own remark on viewing Bengal's treasury, that he was astonished at his own moderation, became a byword for rapacity. Clive died by suicide in 1774. His legacy: coup, plunder, and a revenue regime that made company rule both profitable and destructive. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, Zulu War instigation, 1879. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, 1815 to 1884, was High Commissioner for Southern Africa, 1877 to 1880. What places him on a most evil list is his role in deliberately provoking the Anglo-Zulu War. In December 1878, he issued an ultimatum to King Ceshwayo that demanded, within 30 days, the disbanding of the Zulu army, acceptance of a British resident, the surrender of officers, and sweeping political concessions. Terms he knew the Zulu state could not meet. He acted without explicit approval from London, prioritising a confederation scheme over diplomacy. War followed in January 1879. The early defeat at Isandlwana on January 22, 1879, cost the British about 1,300 lives. Fighting continued through the year until Ulundi, 4th of July 1879, after which the Zulu kingdom was broken up, its authority fragmented, and the country left to civil war and hardship. Frere's policy extended beyond battlefield losses. It destroyed a functioning African state and imposed a settlement that destabilized the region for years. Reaction in Britain was severe. Parliamentary debates and official correspondence rebuked Frere for exceeding instructions. He was censored by the government's oversight and, after the Liberal victory in 1880, recalled. Contemporary critics in the press and in politics called the war unjust and unavoidable. Supporters framed it as necessary for regional scrutiny. On the record, a manufactured casus belli, catastrophic early losses, and the dismantling of Zulu governance. Frere's conduct stands as a prime example of coercive imperial policy driving an avoidable war. Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, Area Bombing Policy, World War II. Arthur Harris, 1892 to 1984, commanded RAF Bomber Command from 1942 to 1945. What places him on a most evil list is his advocacy and execution of area bombing, concentrated attacks on German cities intended to break civilian morale and destroy housing and industry. Acting under the Area Bombing Directive, February 1942, Harris oversaw raids that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Notable operations include Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, July 1943, where a firestorm killed 37,000 to 43,000, and Dresden, February 1945, with around 25,000 dead. Other cities such as Cologne, Essen and Berlin suffered repeated mass casualty raids. Harris was unapologetic, encapsulated by his remark that Germany would reap the whirlwind. Supporters argued the campaign tied down German resources, degraded industry, and complemented Allied strategy. Critics then and since called it terror bombing. In Parliament, figures such as Bishop George Bell condemned the policy. Winston Churchill himself distanced the government from the late war city attacks, questioning the value of the terror bombing of German cities in a March 1945 minute. Harris maintained that he executed government policy as written. Bomber Command paid a severe price. 55,573 RAF aircrew were killed. Harris was honoured in wartime and made a baronet. Yet Bomber Command received no separate campaign medal for decades, reflecting sustained controversy. His London statue, unveiled 1992, remains a focal point for debate. On the record, deliberate area bombing with vast civilian deaths, defended in moral and strategic terms, Harris stands among the most contentious British commanders of the 20th century. Do you agree with the tag of the most evil British leaders on these people? Comment below. We will be covering more about British history and interesting stuff about the UK in the coming days. So subscribe to the British Explainer and press that bell icon to never miss an update.